I thought the creepy rules were just there to scare new employees, until something started knocking from inside storage unit 237. Hey everyone, today I found a really creepy story on Reddit, and I thought I'd share it with you while we play some Minecraft. So grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's get started. It took me more than a year before I could finally tell this story. I'm not asking you to believe me. I probably wouldn't have believed it myself if I'd heard it from someone else. But every word of it happened to me during my first and last night as a security guard at Ashwood Storage. I took the job for one reason only: money. The construction company I'd been working for had shut down, my debts were piling up, and this position was offering $32 an hour with no experience required. The only catch was that every shift was overnight. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. The storage facility sat about 40 minutes outside the city, surrounded by miles of dense pine forest. The moment I pulled up to the old entrance gate with the faded sign reading Ashwood Storage, my phone lost all signal. An elderly man was waiting for me outside the office. "Daniel?" "Yeah." "I'm Carl." His handshake was strangely cold. Inside the office, Carl gave me a quick rundown of the job. Every hour I had to patrol the property, check the locks on every unit, open the front gate for late-night customers if any showed up, and spend the rest of the shift watching the security cameras. Then he slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. At the top it read, "Night Shift Rules." The first 3 rules immediately caught my attention. 1. Never enter Sector C after 2 a.m. 2. If you hear metallic knocking, do not move until it stops. 3. If Camera 9 shows a person, do not leave the office. Camera 9 never shows people. I laughed. "Is this some kind of joke?" Carl looked me straight in the eyes. Every rule on that list was written after someone made a mistake. He didn't smile. A few minutes later, we headed outside for a walk around the property. Sectors A and B looked like any ordinary storage facility. Long rows of metal units, concrete driveways, security lights, nothing unusual. But the moment we reached Sector C, Carl noticeably slowed down. We stopped in front of storage unit 237. He carefully inspected the padlock before speaking. "It's still rented." I looked at him, but nobody's opened it in over 10 years. Yet someone keeps paying the rent. I stared at the old metal door with the faded white number, 237. At the time, it looked completely ordinary. I had no idea that only a few hours later, I'd be praying that door would never open. The first patrol started at 10 p.m. Carl handed me a powerful flashlight and an old walkie-talkie. "If you see anything, call me immediately, and don't try to be a hero. That's how most of the problems around here start." I joked about raccoons, but Carl didn't even smile. The entire property was unnaturally quiet. There wasn't a breath of wind, only the constant hum of the security lights. I walked through sectors A and B, checked every lock, and returned to the office. Nothing happened until midnight. We sat in front of the monitors talking, and Carl seemed like a perfectly normal guy, even though he was the one who had written those bizarre rules. At midnight, I headed out for my second patrol and made a point of paying extra attention to Sector C. As I passed storage unit 237, my flashlight flickered for a split second. I checked the padlock. It was still locked. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint metallic sound behind me. I looked back. No one was there. I figured it was just the metal cooling off and didn't mention it to Carl. But when I got back, he unexpectedly asked, "Everything quiet around Unit 237? I told him yes. About an hour later, while Carl was outside having a cigarette, I was watching the security cameras. I stopped on camera 9, the one overlooking Sector C. I remembered the rule that it never shows people, and smiled to myself. A few seconds later, a human figure briefly appeared at the far end of the lane. I rewound the footage. Nothing. I watched it again. still empty. Right then, Carl came back inside. I told him I thought I'd seen someone on the camera. He didn't even look at the monitor. Instead, he asked, "And you're still sitting in the office?" "Yeah." He let out a noticeable sigh of relief. "Good, because if you'd gone out to check, your shift would have already been over." I wanted to ask what he meant, but at that exact moment the entire facility went dark. A few seconds later, the dim emergency lights flickered on. Carl immediately slammed the office door shut, checked the lock, glanced at the clock. It read 2:46 a.m., and quietly muttered a curse under his breath. Then he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Whatever you hear next, don't go outside." The first knock was so quiet that under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't have noticed it. But in the complete silence of the facility, it sounded as if someone had knocked directly on the office door. Carl silently glanced at the clock and muttered, "It's never started this early before." Camera 9 suddenly came back online, showing Sector C. Storage Unit 237 was still closed, and no one was nearby. Then a second knock echoed through the building, much louder this time, as if someone had slammed their fist against the inside of the door. I started moving toward the monitor, but Carl grabbed my shoulder. "Don't get any closer. If it notices you, it'll start knocking more often." Moments later, the knocks became steady. Knock, knock, knock. It felt like whatever was making the noise knew we were listening. Nothing about the door changed, but the metal around the lock trembled ever so slightly after every impact. "That's exactly what I kept telling myself for the first 3 years," Carl said quietly, after I whispered that it was impossible. A moment later, every security camera came back online. Cameras 8 and 10 showed an empty driveway, but camera 9 showed a tall, unnaturally thin person standing perfectly still in front of Storage Unit 237 with their back to the camera. It hadn't walked into frame. It had simply appeared there. It didn't move. "How many people do you see?" Carl asked. "One," I answered. He slowly closed his eyes, and for the first time that night, I saw real fear on his face. "Then we still have time." Before I could ask what Carl meant by, "we still have time," the figure on camera 9 slowly placed its hand against the door of Storage Unit 237. The knocking stopped instantly. A few seconds later, it began turning only its head toward the camera in a slow, unnatural motion. Suddenly, the screen filled with static, and when the image returned, the driveway was empty. "Did it leave?" I asked. "No," Carl replied. At that moment, the office radio crackled to life. My own voice came through the speaker. "Carl, I'm at Unit 237. Open the gate for me." The problem was that my handheld radio was switched off. Carl immediately cut the transmission. "If you ever hear your own voice over the radio, run. Don't investigate." I demanded an explanation, but something outside crashed to the ground with a deafening bang. A second later, the office door handle slowly turned downward. The door jerked against the lock, but it held. Then the handle turned again, and a quiet woman's voice came from the other side. "Please, let me in. I need help." I instinctively stepped toward the door, but Carl blocked my path. "Don't listen to the words. Listen to the pauses between them." I focused, and then I realized it. Every pause was exactly the same length, as if something was merely imitating human speech. "I'm cold. Please, help me," the voice repeated. Carl went pale and whispered, "It's standing right outside the door." Without taking his eyes off the door, Carl opened a drawer and pulled out an old revolver. "If I ever have to use this, we've already lost. It's not for stopping it. It's for stopping you from doing something stupid," he said. The woman's voice came again from outside, but this time it called me by name. "Daniel, I'm lost." I froze. There was no way anyone out there could have known my name. Carl immediately warned me, "Don't look through the peephole. It always makes you want to look." A moment later, fingernails began slowly scratching across the door. Then someone lightly tapped on the office's side window. I instinctively turned my head and caught a glimpse of myself standing outside. The same jacket, the same flashlight. "It saw you," Carl whispered. "Now it knows who it wants to become." The security cameras covering the office showed nothing at all, even though I had just seen my own double through the glass. Carl explained that the cameras only showed what it wanted us to see. The emergency lights flickered several times, and with every flash, more copies of me appeared outside the window. First 1, then 3, then 4. When the lights came back on for the last time, the window was empty again. Carl looked at the clock. 2:58 a.m. He let out a heavy sigh. "We won't make it until sunrise if we stay in the office. We have to get to the generator room." I couldn't understand Carl. Just moments ago, he had insisted we stay inside the office, and now he was telling me we had to run to the generator room. He explained that the backup battery was about to die. Once the emergency lights went out, the office's electronic lock would fail with them. Carl grabbed 2 spare flashlights and gave me one. "We move fast, we don't run, and whatever happens, don't look back." Just then, the lights flickered again. When they came back on, the office door was standing slightly open. Without saying a word, Carl pushed it shut, but from the other side came a quiet laugh. He didn't hesitate. He threw the door open and rushed outside, and I followed him. The storage facility seemed completely lifeless until metallic knocking erupted behind us, first from one storage unit, then from several, and within seconds almost every metal door in the complex was rattling at once. We were only a few yards from the generator building when someone stepped into the beam of my flashlight. A tall, unnaturally thin man stood silently in the middle of the road, blocking our way. "Don't get any closer," Carl whispered. The figure slowly turned toward us, and I saw a much younger version of Carl. No gray hair, the same security uniform. The real Carl let out a heavy sigh. This time, it decided to remember me. The younger Carl looked completely real. He smiled calmly and said, "You're late for your shift again." The real Carl immediately told me not to listen, but the double kept talking. "Tell the kid why you stayed here. Tell him about your partner, the one who never came back." Carl remained silent for a long moment before raising his revolver and firing. The bullet passed straight through the double without leaving a mark. He only laughed. "That's why you haven't been able to leave this place for 30 years, he said before his body crumbled into black dust. I demanded an explanation, and Carl finally admitted the truth. "I lied. I haven't worked here for 30 years. I've been unable to leave this place for 30 years. We hurried into the generator room, where dozens of photographs of night guards from different years covered the wall. Among them was a picture of a young Carl dated 1974, along with photos of every guard who had come after him. The last photograph stopped me cold. It was a picture of me, taken earlier that very evening, even though no one had taken it. My name was already beneath it, along with the current year. I slowly turned toward Carl and asked, "Who took this picture?" Carl locked the generator room and admitted he had no idea who took the guards' photographs. I looked closer at the pictures and noticed that behind every guard stood a dark figure, and with each passing year it seemed to move a little closer. Carl quietly warned me, "Don't stare at them for too long." He restarted the generator and power returned to the entire complex. After checking his watch, 3:07, he said, "Before 3 o'clock, it waits for someone to make a mistake. After 3, it starts making its move." Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. An unfamiliar voice called out to Carl, "I found a way out through the forest. You can still make it." Carl went pale and whispered, "Bill?" It was the voice of his partner, who had disappeared 30 years earlier. After saying, "Don't repeat my mistake," the transmission was abruptly cut off. At that exact moment, the lights inside the generator room went out, even though the generator was still running. My flashlight swept across the ceiling, revealing words deeply carved into the concrete. "Don't let it return to storage unit 237. A second later, dozens of metal doors outside slammed open at the same time, as if every storage unit in the complex had opened on its own. Carl stared toward the exit and quietly said, "It's no longer inside." We ran out of the generator room and saw that almost every storage unit was standing open, even though all the locks were still intact. Inside were nothing but ordinary belongings, but every shadow unnaturally stretched toward Sector C. Carl warned me not to step on them, and we carefully made our way back toward the office. Almost immediately, we heard footsteps behind us, perfectly matching our own. The faster we walked, the closer they came. Carl ordered me not to look back, and we sprinted to the office, slamming the door shut behind us. A second later, something began pounding violently against it, leaving 4 deep claw marks before everything suddenly fell silent. Then, camera number 9 turned itself back on. Storage unit 237 was now open, and from the darkness, a security guard slowly stepped out, carrying a flashlight. As he moved into the light, I saw the name patch on his uniform. It said only one word, Daniel. I couldn't take my eyes off the monitor. The security guard wearing the Daniel name patch was my exact double. He copied every movement I made until Carl suddenly pulled me away from the screen. "Don't mirror his movements. He's mirroring yours." The double smiled, shined his flashlight on the 237 sign, and revealed the open storage unit, where nothing but endless darkness waited inside. Then he slowly raised his hand and beckoned me closer. At that exact moment, a quiet voice echoed inside my head. "Come back. This is where you belong." I almost walked toward the exit, but Carl stopped me. He explained that it couldn't force anyone to do anything. It could only convince them. Then he confessed the truth. 30 years earlier, he had fled, leaving his partner behind at storage unit 237, and ever since then the complex had never allowed him to leave. For one person to escape, someone else had to take the guard's place. That was the moment I realized Carl might not have brought me here by accident. For the first time that night, I wasn't afraid of storage unit 237. I was afraid of Carl. I became convinced that he had brought me here to take my place. But he calmly explained that if he had truly wanted to save himself, he would have told me nothing and simply waited for the place to claim me. During the last 30 years, he had never allowed the entity to take another guard because he couldn't force someone else to carry the guilt he had lived with. Carl showed me an old photograph of himself and his partner, Bill. Written on the back were the words, "If at least one of us gets out, that's enough." At that moment, camera number 9 came back to life. My double was walking toward the office, even though he appeared on none of the other cameras. Seconds later, the camera above the entrance showed my duplicate standing right outside the door. He knocked softly and silently mouthed the words, "He's lying." I no longer knew whom to believe. Just then, the first wind of the night swept across the complex. Dozens of open storage doors screeched in unison, and Carl glanced at the clock, 3:41 a.m., before quietly saying, "We have 20 minutes left, and only one chance to end this forever." Carl pulled an old notebook from a hidden compartment. It had belonged to Bill, and one sentence was written over and over throughout its pages. "It never comes out of the storage unit. It makes you step inside." Carl explained that for all these years he hadn't been guarding the storage complex. He had been guarding the door to storage unit 237 because the entity only needed someone to cross the threshold willingly. Then he showed me an old brass key and admitted it was the real key to unit 237. It could lock the door forever, but only from the inside. That meant one of us would have to sacrifice himself. Suddenly, every monitor switched to the same image, the open doorway of storage unit 237, where my double stood holding an identical brass key. Smiling, he slowly snapped it in half. At that exact moment, the real key in Carl's hands cracked down the middle and broke apart as well. Carl went pale and whispered, "It's never done that before." Then, from somewhere deep within Sector C, we heard a long, slow creak as the door to storage unit 237 swung even farther open, as though whatever was inside had finally decided to come out. After seeing the broken key, Carl realized Bill had never finished writing the truth. On the final pages of the notebook was a new message. "Don't close the door. Destroy the thing that makes it exist." A hand-drawn map pointed to a hidden tunnel beneath storage unit 237. We rushed into Sector C, where every storage unit stood completely empty, while a cold mist drifted out of the open doorway of Unit 237. Beneath an overgrown hatch, we discovered an old underground passage leading to a circular concrete chamber. In the center stood a wooden chair with a human skeleton chained to it by rusted iron shackles. Hanging from its neck was a metal tag reading "Head Security," bearing the name of the storage complex's very first head of security. Beneath it, someone had scratched a final message into the metal. I couldn't hold it back. At that exact moment, the heavy steel door behind us slammed shut on its own, and for the first time that night, we heard neither a voice nor knocking, but a slow, deep breath, as if something that had been silent for decades had finally come back to life. Inside the underground chamber, we heard a deep breath, as if the bunker itself had started breathing. The ceiling was covered with words carved into the concrete, the largest warning reading, "It learns." Dozens of spent shell casings surrounded the chained skeleton, and its hands were deeply scratched, as though it had spent years trying to break free. The skull faced a dark corner where a small wooden door stood, decorated with a child's drawing of the sun. Carl whispered that Bill had never mentioned such a door. Then 3 quiet knocks came from the other side, followed by the voice of a little boy asking, "Can I go home?" I instinctively stepped toward the door, but Carl stopped me, reminding me that if there really were a child behind it, then that child had been knocking for almost 60 years. The voice begged for help, but Carl realized the entity had changed its strategy. It was no longer trying to frighten us, it was trying to earn our sympathy. A heavy silence followed, and then a familiar voice quietly whispered from behind the door, "Carl, don't run away this time." Carl turned deathly pale and barely managed to whisper, "That was Bill's voice." Carl turned pale after hearing Bill's voice and whispered that the entity knew everything because it had witnessed that night itself. We noticed that the skeleton's chains disappeared deep into the foundation, while the cold mist slowly flowed toward the small wooden door marked with a child's drawing of the sun. The moment I touched it, I was pulled into a vision. Ashwood Storage was brand new. Young Carl and Bill were laughing together, and the owner admitted that during construction, they had discovered an old military bunker beneath the site, but simply sealed it in concrete because removing it would have been too expensive. The vision faded, and I realized the evil hadn't been created, it had been accidentally awakened. Carl silently agreed, but at that exact moment, dozens of tiny hands began pounding on the wooden door from the other side, while countless children's voices whispered together in perfect unison, "Open the door." The children's voices behind the door sounded perfectly identical, as though they were all fragments of a single voice. When Carl shined his flashlight at the door, the knocking stopped instantly, replaced by a disturbing laugh that sounded almost, but not quite, human. Brushing away years of dust, Carl uncovered a metal plaque engraved with the words, "Do not open under any circumstances," dated October 14th, 1968, and signed by the storage complex owner, the chief of police, and a military engineer, proof that they had known the truth and agreed to bury it forever. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed directly above us. Cracks spread across the ceiling, and a thick, black liquid began dripping through them. We rushed toward the exit, only to discover the underground door had somehow locked itself. Then, behind us, someone quietly cleared his throat. The skeleton had vanished from the chair, leaving only empty chains and its skull resting on the floor. Standing calmly in the center of the room was an elderly man wearing an old security uniform with a rusted head security badge. He smiled politely and said, "I was beginning to worry that no one would come to replace me tonight." The elderly guard introduced himself as Henry Walker, the first head of security at the complex, and explained that he had willingly allowed himself to be chained there because the true danger had never been inside the bunker. It lived within the people who entered it. According to Henry, Storage Unit 237 was not a prison, but a lock, preventing the entity from leaving the property, which was why the facility always needed a night guard to keep it functioning. Carl finally realized that he really had been holding the evil back all those years, just not in the way he had believed. Suddenly, heavy impacts thundered from above. The concrete floor shook violently, and for the first time, Henry looked genuinely afraid. "It understands now," he whispered. When Carl asked what it understood, Henry looked directly at me and replied, "That you already know the truth." At that exact moment, every flashlight went out, plunging the room into complete darkness, and from every corner, dozens of voices identical to mine whispered in perfect unison, "Now, I know how to get out." The police found me alone outside the gates of Ashwood Storage, and despite an extensive search, there was no trace of Carl. The security cameras had no recordings, and officially I had spent that night completely alone. Soon afterward, the facility was shut down due to foundation failure, demolished, and every trace of Storage Unit 237 and the underground bunker disappeared. For nearly a year, I avoided working night shifts until one day I happened to stop near a brand new storage facility in another state. At the entrance was a list of rules for the night guards, and the final one made my blood run cold. Never open Storage Unit 237. When I looked up, I saw Carl standing in the same security uniform. He silently pressed a finger to his lips, slowly shook his head, then disappeared between the rows of storage units. I ran after him, but all I found was an endless row of identical doors, the last of which was marked 237. Since that day, every single night at exactly 2:37 a.m., my phone vibrates. There is no phone number, no message, just one system notification. Security shift started,